The plasma fire scorched the air inches from Corporal Vex Torrigan's face as he dove behind the twisted wreckage of what had once been humanity's most advanced outpost. The acrid smell of melted metal and ozone filled his nostrils, mixing with the coppery taste of blood from his split lip. Around him, the silence that followed the alien barrage was deafening. No chatter, no friendly fire, no screams of the wounded. Just him and the rhythmic thrum of the Kathmorian Hive ship hovering overhead like a mechanical storm cloud. 3 days ago, Firebase Omega had housed 200 souls. Scientists, engineers, soldiers, all dedicated to humanity's first foothold in the Kepler system. Now, Torrigan crouched alone among their graves, his battle-scarred armor the only thing standing between Earth's secrets and an enemy that viewed individual consciousness as a disease to be purged. The Kathmorians weren't just conquerors, they were assimilators. Their collective mind absorbed entire species, turning billions of unique voices into a single, suffocating harmony. Every planet they touched became a node in their ever-expanding neural network. Every captured being another neuron in their galactic brain. Torrigan checked his ammunition. 17 rounds in his plasma rifle, 3 grenades, and a combat knife. That had saved his life more times than he could count. Not much against a hive that numbered in the millions. But Marines didn't measure victory by odds, they measured it by the ground. They refused to give up. The corporal's enhanced hearing caught the subtle shift in the air currents. They were coming. Through the smoke and debris, he could see them, tall, angular forms moving with unnatural synchronization. Their chitinous exoskeletons gleamed like oil in the dim light, and their multiple eyes tracked in perfect unison. Number, individual thought, no personal fear or ambitions, the cold efficiency of the collective. Firebase Omega, this is Corporal Torrigan, he whispered into his cum, knowing no one would answer, but needing to speak the words anyway. Perimeter has been breached. All personnel here except myself. Base is compromised, but classified data remains secure. He paused, watching the aliens spread out in their flawless formation. I will hold this position. The lead Kathmorian raised its weaponer, sleek instrument that hummed with lethal energy. Behind it, dozens more emerged from the smoke, their collective gaze fixed on the last defender of human independence. To them, Torrigan was an anomaly, a single discordant note in what should have been a harmonious conquest. But as the Marine rose from cover, his rifle aimed at the approaching swarm, he carried something the Hive could never understand or assimilate. The fierce individuality that made humans fight hardest when they stood alone. His finger found the trigger, and in that moment, before the battle resumed, Torrigan smiled. The Kathmorians had devoured 1,000 worlds, absorbed countless civilizations, but they had never faced a United States Marine who understood that some things were worth dying for and that freedom's greatest victories often came from those willing to stand against impossible odds. The first plasma bolt lit up the devastated outpost like a star being born. The explosion that followed Torrigan's opening salvo sent 3 Kathmorians sprawling across the compound's scorched ground. Their synchronized movements faltered for exactly 0.7 seconds, a delay that spoke volumes to a Marine trained to exploit every tactical advantage. The Hive's strength was also its weakness. Damage one node, and the entire local network experienced feedback. Torrigan rolled behind. A fallen communication array, as return fire turned the air into a lethal light show. The aliens' weapon discharge patterns were mathematical, predictable. They fired in sequence, each blast calculated to maximum efficiency. But efficiency wasn't adaptability. While they recalibrated after each exchange, Torrigan moved on instinct and decades of training. His enhanced tactical display flickered to life inside his helmet visor, overlaying heat signatures and movement patterns onto his field of vision. The Kathmorians were converging on his position in a perfect spiral formation, their collective mind already calculating his probable escape routes. What they couldn't predict was that Torrigan had no intention of escaping. The Marine pulled his first grenade, armed it, and sent it arcing toward the tightest cluster of aliens. But instead of the standard fragmentation device they expected, this was an EMP-charged military-grade electromagnetic pulse designed to disrupt enemy electronics. The detonation sent a wave of invisible energy cascading through the alien formation, and suddenly their perfect synchronization crumbled. For 17 precious seconds, the Kithmorians stumbled like newborns learning to walk. Their collective consciousness reeled from the electromagnetic disruption. Individual units attempting to process sensory data without the guiding voice of the Hive. Torrigan didn't waste the opportunity. His plasma rifle sang its deadly song, each shot finding its mark with surgical precision. He moved like a force of nature through the compound, using every piece of cover, every shadow, every blind spot in the alien formation. The Kithmorians' superior numbers meant nothing when they couldn't coordinate their response. But the EMP's effects were temporary. As the electromagnetic interference faded, Torrigan watched the alien survivors snap back into their terrifying unity. Their multifaceted eyes tracked his position with renewed focus, and he could feel the weight of their collective intelligence pressing against him like a physical force. "That's right," Torrigan muttered, chambering another round. "You felt that, didn't you? Felt what it's like to be alone inside your own head." The remaining Kithmorians, nearly 30 strong, began to move with renewed purpose, but their formation had changed. Instead of the flowing organic patterns they'd used before, they now advanced in rigid geometries, sacrificing efficiency for protection against electromagnetic disruption. They were learning, adapting, but their adaptation revealed something crucial. They were afraid. A collective consciousness that had absorbed countless species across the galaxy was afraid of one. Humans' ability to think independently. Tactical display identified a weakness in their new formation. The rigid structure created a blind spot, approximately 40 meters to his northeast, a gap just wide enough for a determined Marine to exploit. He calculated the distance, the ammunition required, the probable casualties he could inflict before. They adjusted again. The numbers weren't in his favor. But numbers had never defined a Marine's duty. As he prepared for his next assault, Torrigan caught a glimpse of something that stopped him cold. One of the Kithmorians had broken formation. A single alien unit was moving independently, its weapon lowered, its multiple eyes focused not on him but on the scattered remains of the human defenders. For the first time since the battle began, individual curiosity had emerged from the collective consciousness. The EMP hadn't just disrupted their coordination, had awakened something the Hive had tried to suppress. The capacity for independent thought was spreading through their ranks like a virus, and the collective mind was struggling to contain it. Torrigan's smile widened as he realized the truth. He wasn't just fighting for Firebase Omega anymore. He was fighting for the minds the Hive had tried to enslave. The isolated Kithmorian knelt beside the body of Lieutenant Caswell, its elongated fingers hovering just above the fallen Marine's service ribbons. The alien's head tilted in a gesture that seemed almost human. Torrigan watched through his rifle scope, finger poised on the trigger, as something unprecedented unfolded before him. The creature was thinking, not as part of the collective, not as a node in the vast neural network, but as an individual entity grappling with concepts its species had forgotten eons ago. The sight should have been impossible. Every intelligence report indicated that Kithmorian individuality had been purged from their genome centuries before their first conquest. The main alien force had halted their advance, their perfect formations wavering as internal conflict rippled through their shared consciousness. Torrigan could see the struggle playing out in their jerky, uncertain movements. The hive mind was trying to reassert control, but something fundamental had been damaged. The EMP hadn't just disrupted their electronics, it had created cracks in the mental barriers that kept individual thoughts suppressed. Torrigan made a decision that went against every tactical manual ever written. He lowered his weapon and stepped into the open. "You're starting to remember, aren't you?" he called out to the kneeling alien. His voice carried across the devastated compound, clear and strong. "What it feels like to be yourself. To have thoughts that belong to you alone." The creature's multiple eyes snapped toward him, but instead of the cold, calculating stare he'd expected, Torrigan saw something that chilled him to the bone: confusion, fear, and beneath it all, a desperate hunger for understanding. The collective's response was immediate and violent. The other Kithmorians raised their weapons as one, but their shots went wild. The internal conflict was spreading, each independent thought creating more cracks in their unity. Some aliens fired at Torrigan, others hesitated, and a few impossibly lowered their weapons entirely. The kneeling Kithmorian rose slowly, its movements uncertain but unmistakably its own. When it spoke, its voice was a harsh whisper that seemed to come from a throat unused to forming individual words. "I remember," it said, each word a struggle against millennia of conditioning. "Before the unity, before the voice became all voices, we were ... Tethkorian. We were free." The revelation hit Torrigan like a physical blow. The Kithmorians weren't conquerors, they were victims. The first victims of their own collective consciousness, their individual identities consumed so long ago that they'd forgotten they'd ever existed. "What's your name?" Torrigan asked, his rifle still lowered. The alien, the Tethkorian, clutched its head, as if fighting against invisible chains. I was Kethver. I was Kethver, of the seventh spiral. I had ... I had children." The last word came out as a wail of anguish that seemed to shake the very air. The other aliens were in full chaos now. Some were fighting to maintain collective unity, while others were experiencing the first stirrings of individual consciousness in centuries. The Hive ship overhead began to pulse with erratic light patterns, and their mechanical extensions were affected by the psychological upheaval below. Torrigan realized he was witnessing something unprecedented: the death of a collective consciousness, and the rebirth of an entire species' individuality. The EMP hadn't just disrupted their electronics, it had somehow damaged the neural pathways that enforced their unity, allowing suppressed individual personalities to surface. But the collective wasn't giving up without a fight. Through the chaos, Torrigan could see some Kithmorians regaining their coordination, their shared consciousness reasserting control through sheer force. These loyalist units began systematically targeting the newly awakened individuals, treating their own kind as enemies to be purged. Kethver stumbled toward Torrigan, its voice growing stronger with each independent thought. "Help us," it pleaded. The voice ... "It's trying to silence us again. We don't want to forget. We don't want to go back to the emptiness." Torrigan looked at the alien, at the being who had once been part of humanity's greatest threat, and was now its most desperate ally. Around them, a civil war was erupting, as awakened Tethkorians fought against their own collective programming. The Marine raised his rifle, but this time not at the aliens seeking independence. Instead, he aimed at the loyalist Kithmorians, who were trying to silence the voices of freedom that had finally found the courage to speak. "Then we fight together," Torrigan said, and pulled the trigger. The plasma bolt from Torrigan's rifle found its mark, dropping a loyalist Kithmorian that had been advancing on a newly awakened Tethkorian female. She looked up at the Marine with eyes that held gratitude and emotion that shouldn't have existed in a collective consciousness, but was now burning bright in dozens of individual minds across the compound. Kethver moved to stand beside Torrigan, its own weapon now trained on the forces trying to maintain the collective's control. "There are others," it said, its voice growing steadier with each passing moment. "On the ship above, some of us have been fighting the voice in secret for generations, hiding individual thoughts in the depths of our minds." The tactical situation had transformed completely. What had been a desperate last stand against overwhelming odds was now a three-way battle. Torrigan, and the Awakening. Tethkorians against the Loyalist collective forces, while the Hive ship above struggled to maintain control over its own crew. The mechanical precision of the alien assault had devolved into chaos as individual personalities clashed with collective imperatives. "How many of your people are truly free?" Torrigan asked, ducking as plasma fire from the ship's defensive systems scorched the ground where he'd been standing. "Not enough," Kethver replied, returning fire with remarkable accuracy for someone learning to think independently. "But more, every moment. Your weapon, the electromagnetic pulse, damaged the neural suppressors we didn't even know we carried. Each time one of us breaks free, it makes it easier for others to follow." The Awakening was spreading like wildfire through the alien ranks. Torrigan watched in amazement as Kithmorians throughout the compound began to show signs of individual consciousness, hesitation in their movements, deviation from standard formations, and most tellingly, the way they started to look at each other with recognition rather than mere acknowledgement. But the collective wasn't defenseless. The Loyalist forces had regrouped into a tight defensive formation, their shared consciousness allowing them to coordinate in ways the newly independent Tethkorians couldn't match. Worse, the Hive ship's weapon systems were beginning to target indiscriminately. If the collective couldn't maintain control, it would eliminate all potential dissidents. "We need to get to that ship," Torrigan said, studying the massive vessel hovering overhead. Its hull was marked with geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe, not decoration, but neural interfaces that allowed the collective consciousness to extend its control throughout the vessel. "Impossible," Kethver replied. "The ship's defenses are controlled by the same collective mind that's falling apart down here," Torrigan interrupted. "You said there were others on the ship fighting the voice. What if we could help them break free?" A new voice joined their conversation, another awakened Tethkorian, this one bearing the scars of what looked like self-inflicted wounds. "I was, Nethera, of the third mind caste. I remember the ship's systems. If we could reach the central consciousness hub, the neural suppressors," Kethver finished, understanding dawning in its multiple eyes. "If we could destroy them completely, every Tethkorian in the fleet would be free to remember who they were." The plan was insane, desperate, and likely suicidal. But as Torrigan looked around at the growing number of awakened aliens beings, who were experiencing the joy and terror of individual thought for the first time in centuries, he realized they had something the collective could never understand. They had hope. "How do we get up there?" he asked. Nethera pointed to a section of the compound, where several small transport pods had crashed during the initial assault. "Those pods have short-range flight capability. If we could repair one." The Loyalist forces were advancing again, their formation tighter and more desperate than before. The collective was losing control, and its response was becoming increasingly violent. Plasma bolts rained down from the ship above, while ground forces pressed their attack with mechanical determination. Torrigan counted his remaining ammunition, 6 rounds in his rifle, 2 grenades, and whatever weapons the awakened Tethkorians could provide. Against them stood not just the Loyalist ground forces, but an entire Hive ship filled with collective-controlled aliens. "We're going to need a distraction," he said, loading his second EMP grenade. "Something big enough to give us time to reach." "Those pods." Kethver looked at its fellow awakened Tethkorians, then back at Torrigan. "We'll hold them here," it said simply. "You and Nethera reach the ship. Free our people." The Marine felt a familiar tightness in his chest. The same feeling he'd had when saying goodbye to fellow Marines who wouldn't be coming home. But these weren't his Marines. They were former enemies who had found something worth dying for. The right to be themselves. "Semper Fi," Torrigan said, not sure if the aliens would understand. Kethver tilted its head, then straightened in what might have been a salute. "Until individual thought dies, we are eternal." The transport pod shuddered as it lifted off from the compound's surface, its alien systems responding sluggishly to Nethera's desperate manipulations. Below them, the battle raged on, as awakened Tethkorians fought desperately against their collective-controlled brethren. Torrigan could see Kethfer leading a desperate charge against the Loyalist forces. The newly freed alien moving with a courage that belonged entirely to itself. "The ship's docking bays are sealed," Nethera said, its multiple hands dancing across controls that looked more organic than mechanical. "But there are maintenance ports along the hull, if we can reach one." Torrigan studied the massive vessel, looming above them. Up close, he could see that the ship wasn't just a machine, it was partially alive, its hull covered in neural pathways that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. The sight was both beautiful and terrifying, a testament to a technology that had merged consciousness with engineering. There, Nethera pointed to a section of the hull where the pulsing patterns were dim and erratic. "That's where the consciousness hub is located. The neural suppressors will be nearby." The pod lurched as defensive systems locked onto them. Energy bolts flashed past their cockpit, and Torrigan could hear the screech of hull metal being superheated. But the ship's defenses were operating with the same chaos that affected everything else. Connected to the collective consciousness, some weapon systems fired accurately while others shot wildly into space. "Can you get us inside without killing us?" Torrigan asked. "I'm remembering how," Nethera replied, and there was wonder in its voice. "Before the Unity, I was a void pilot. I flew between the stars, free and alone. I had forgotten how beautiful it was." The pod spiraled through the defensive fire with movements that were part calculation, part artistry. Nethera was rediscovering skills that had been suppressed for centuries, and with each maneuver, the alien seemed to grow more confident in its individuality. They reached the maintenance port, just as the pod's systems began to fail. Torrigan felt the artificial gravity flicker as they docked, and emergency lights bathed the cramped cockpit in red. Through the viewport, he could see into the ship's interior corridors that seemed to breathe. Walls lined with neural interfaces, and everywhere the soft glow of collective consciousness, maintaining its grip on reality. "The hub is 17 levels down," Nethera said, consulting what looked like a living map that grew across the cockpit wall. "But the passages will be defended." They moved through the ship like ghosts, Nethera's knowledge of the vessel's layout, combining with Torrigan's combat training to create an unlikely but effective partnership. The corridors they traversed were unlike anything in human engineering, walls that responded to touch, floors that seemed to anticipate their footsteps, and everywhere, the sense of being inside something that was simultaneously machine and organism. First group of defenders they encountered moved with the perfect coordination of the collective, but Torrigan's EMP grenade disrupted their unity long enough for him and Nethera to eliminate the threat. As they advanced deeper into the ship, they began to encounter Tethkorians who showed signs of the awakening hesitation in their movements, confusion in their eyes, and most importantly, the dawning realization that their thoughts might be their own. "Help us remember," one of them whispered as they passed, its weapon lowered. "Help us find ourselves." By the time they reached the consciousness hub, a small group of awakening Tethkorians had joined them. Each new individual they encountered weakened the collective's control over the ship, creating a cascade effect that spread through the neural networks like wildfire. The hub itself was a vast chamber filled with towering structures that hummed with neural energy. At the center stood the neural suppressor array, a collection of crystalline formations that pulsed with the same bioluminescent patterns they'd seen throughout the ship. The sight was hypnotically beautiful and utterly alien. "That's it," Nethera breathed. "The source of our silence. For so long, I felt its weight pressing against my thoughts, keeping me from being myself." Torrigan studied the array, looking for weaknesses. The structures were heavily shielded and defended by automated systems. But more concerning were the dozen collective-controlled Tethkorians that guarded the chamber. These weren't ordinary soldiers, they were the most loyal servants of the Unity, their individual personalities so thoroughly suppressed that they might be beyond redemption. "Can you destroy it?" he asked. "Not from here," Nethera replied. The suppressors are protected by multiple redundancies. But if we could overload the neural pathways that feed them. The answer came from an unexpected source. One of the awakening Tethkorians, who had joined them, stepped forward, an engineer whose individual memories were returning in fragments. I remember the ship's construction, it said. The neural pathways converge in the central core. If we could create a feedback loop. Torrigan looked at his remaining equipment, his last EMP grenade, a few plasma charges, and the combat knife that had never failed him. Against them stood the most heavily defended position on the ship, protected by enemies who would fight with the mechanical perfection of the collective mind. But around him stood beings who had found the courage to remember who they were, who had chosen individual thought over collective security. They were facing impossible odds, but for the first time in centuries, they were facing them as themselves. Then we go in together, Torrigan said, activating his final EMP grenade. For everyone who's forgotten what it means to be free. The EMP detonation turned the consciousness hub into a maelstrom of chaos. Neural pathways overloaded in cascading failures. Bioluminescent patterns flickered and died, and for a precious few seconds, the collective's iron grip on reality wavered. Torrigan moved through the confusion like a force of nature, his plasma rifle speaking its deadly language while awakened. Tethkorians fought beside him with a ferocity born of newfound hope. But the collective's guardians weren't ordinary soldiers. They were the most thoroughly conditioned servants of the Unity. Beings whose individual selves had been so completely erased that they fought with mechanical perfection, even as chaos erupted around them. Their coordinated response was immediate and devastating. The core, Nethera shouted over the sound of weapons fire. We need to reach the neural core. Torrigan could see their objective through the battle, a massive crystalline structure at the chamber's heart that pulsed with the rhythm of a dying heartbeat. The neural suppressors drew their power from this core, and if they could overload it, every Tethkorian in the fleet would be free to remember their individual identities. The Marine's tactical display showed him the grim mathematics of their situation. 12 awakened Tethkorians himself, and maybe 30 seconds before the collective's reinforcements arrived. Against them stood forces that knew no fear, no doubt, no hesitation, only the mechanical certainty of the Hive mind. Cover me, Torrigan said, pulling his plasma charges. I'm going for the core. What followed was pure poetry written in violence and sacrifice. The awakened Tethkorians fought with a desperate courage that their collective-controlled brethren couldn't understand or counter. They made tactical mistakes, born of inexperience with individual thought, but they compensated with something the collective had never possessed, the willingness to die for something greater than themselves. Nethera fell first, a plasma bolt, burning through its chest as it shielded Torrigan from enemy fire. As it died, the former Void pilot whispered, I remembered flying free among the stars. One by one, the awakened Tethkorians gave their lives to buy Torrigan the seconds he needed. Each death weakened the collective's control over the ship. As neural networks designed for unity struggled to process the concept of individual sacrifice, Torrigan reached the core with 2 plasma charges and the certainty that he wouldn't survive the explosion. The crystalline structure towered above him, its surface reflecting the chaos of the battle in fractured images that seemed to show glimpses of suppressed memories, Tethkorian children playing in alien sunlight, artists creating beauty for its own sake, lovers sharing thoughts that belonged to them alone. As he placed the charges, Torrigan felt the weight of the collective consciousness pressing against his mind like a physical force. For a moment, he caught a glimpse of what the Tethkorians had endured, the suffocating silence of shared thought, the horror of being erased from your own existence, the desperate longing for the simple right to be yourself. For every voice that was silenced, Torrigan whispered, arming the charges. For every thought that was stolen, for freedom. The explosion that followed lit up the consciousness hub like a newborn star. Neural pathways overloaded throughout the ship as feedback, cascaded through every system designed to suppress individual thought. The effect spread beyond the vessel itself, racing through quantum-entangled networks to reach every Kithmorian, every Tethkorian in the fleet, on 1,000 ships, in 1,000,000 minds. The silence that had reigned for centuries finally broke in. The ruins of Firebase Omega. Kethver felt the change first, as a lightness in its thoughts, as if chains it hadn't known existed, suddenly fell away. Around the compound, collective-controlled aliens stopped in mid-motion as suppressed personalities surged to the surface. They looked at each other with new eyes, remembering names they hadn't spoken in generations. Throughout the galaxy, the effect rippled outward. On conquered worlds, Tethkorian occupation forces stood down as they remembered their own homes, their own families, their own reasons for existing beyond the collective's will. The greatest military force in known space transformed overnight from conquerors into liberated beings struggling to understand what they had lost. The Hive ship crashed into Firebase Omega's moon 3 hours later, its systems completely offline, as the crew struggled to remember how to think as individuals. But from its wreckage, thousands of Tethkorians emerged, not as invaders, but as refugees from their own collective consciousness. Kethver found Torrigan's body in the ruins of the Consciousness Hub, the Marine clutching his empty rifle, even in death. Around him lay the plasma charges that had shattered the neural core and, with it, the chains that had bound an entire species to collective servitude. He taught us that freedom is not something that can be given, Kethver said at the memorial service, speaking to an audience of humans and newly awakened Tethkorians. It is something that must be chosen, again and again, no matter the cost. He showed us that one individual, thinking freely, can change the fate of entire civilizations. Years later, when historians of both species studied the Battle of Firebase Omega, they would marvel at the impossibility of what had occurred. One Marine, facing impossible odds, had not only saved humanity from assimilation, but had liberated an entire species from the tyranny of collective thought. But Kethver, who had become the first freely elected leader of the Tethkorian Republic, understood the deeper truth. Corporal Vex Torrigan hadn't just fought for human freedom. He had fought for the principle that every conscious being deserved the right to think their own thoughts, dream their own dreams, and choose their own destiny. In the end, freedom had indeed never bowed. It had stood firm in the heart of one Marine, who understood that some battles are worth fighting alone, and some victories can only be won by those who refuse to surrender their individuality to any collective, no matter how powerful. The memorial at Firebase Omega bore a simple inscription. Here stood one who remembered that the greatest weapon against tyranny is a single free thought, courageously expressed, and across the galaxy, in 1,000 tongues, both human and Tethkorian, that truth echoed through the stars.